Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So today we're going to look at something that I don't think I've looked at before on my channel, but something which you encounter quite a lot in the world of antique swords, and they are a pretty interesting type of cutlass that are commonly known today as the Klewang or Klewang. And many of you will also recognise that this was a basis for a later US naval saber, or naval cutlass rather. But it has its origins actually in the Far East, or rather Southeast Asia, in the 19th century, and the Dutch East India Company, or Netherlands East India Company, principally in Sumatra. At the time, in the 1890s, there was a need for the native police forces and the military essentially fighting against insurgents and uprisings in that area to have a sidearm. Now initially they were given cavalry sabres, but these were found to be too unwieldy in the sort of forest that they were operating. They did find that hand weapons were very important, partly because the insurgents would attack, it was guerrilla warfare, very sort of, forested area. And they would often find that firearms just weren't really cutting the mustard. Also, it has to be said that probably for the most part, these native police and essentially militia were not necessarily armed with the best firearms of the period. But in addition, it was even found that where they did have revolvers and things like this, or carbines, in which would have been rifled bolt action carbines at this time, that in some cases they simply weren't being able to shoot into the enemy or get repeated shots off before they were in hand-to-hand combat. So close combat weapons, hand weapons, were very important. Now, because in this area the native police forces were actually made up of essentially of local people, they did have access to their own, shall we say, native weaponry, which for the most part would have been the kris and things like the native version of the Klewang, things like the parang and things like this. So in fact, the Klewang itself, although it superficially does look like a sort of, almost like a pirate cutlass, the kind of stereotypical view of a pirate cutlass, it is actually influenced by those swords. And the early versions, the kind of pre-regulation versions, do sometimes have native blades or native style blades on cavalry hilts, or should we say European style hilts. So let's have a little look at what we've actually got here. So first up, I should say that these weren't actually known at the time that this was made as the Klewang. And now I'm going to butcher this word because I don't know how it's said in Dutch, but it's written something like Maréchaussée. So these were actually known, as I understand it, up until, in the official regulations anyway, up until about 1940, these were known as the Maréchaussée. Now, sable just means sabre. The Maréchaussés were the native police. So essentially, we can translate this into English as the native police sabre. So they weren't actually, technically, or at least in the official documents, they weren't known as Klewangs, they weren't known even as cutlasses or something like this. They were just known as sabres for the native police, for the essentially militias that were keeping law and order, should we say, in that part of the world. And they went through various different iterations, various different models and patterns, starting officially in 1898. Maybe 97, 98. You find different sources on in different books and different websites, but I think probably 1898. Before 1898, that's not to say they didn't exist, but there were sort of non-regulation, should we say, unofficial, unpatented versions of these. The first one that came in 1898 was very similar to this. This is actually we'll talk about the scabbard in a second. This is actually the second model from 1905, which they made a few changes, which I'll talk about in a second. But first of all, before I go on, I just want to point you to the under here, the information underneath this video, and there is a very good thread which you can read below, which actually gives a vast amount more detail about the evolution of these swords and use of them as well, and terminologies and everything else, by someone called Ian, who I don't know his surname. I'm sorry, Ian, but thank you very much for putting this online. It's been very educational. Obviously, I've known about Klewangs for many years, but I certainly didn't know that level of detail until I read that thread. So very useful. If you want to learn a hell of a lot more about these, go and read that. So this video really is a summary. This is the 1905 model, and it has to be said, I said I'd come back to the scabbard and I am doing it straight away. This is a slightly later modified scabbard. So the original scabbard would look slightly different from that, but this seems to be the 1905 pattern, which is the second model of the official regulation Klewang, or Maréchaussée sabel, as I think it was called. And this is made by PD Loonschloss of Solingen. Now, these were made in various different places. A lot of them were actually made obviously in the Netherlands, but a lot of them were made in Solingen, seems to be principally by Loonschloss. So Loonschloss must have picked up a major contract, or did pick up a major contract for making these. And you'll see the characteristics. So let's be a little bit careful with the blade, because it is actually quite sharp. Incidentally, as a collector and dealer, what you often find, you often find these Klewangs for sale, but principally what you find are the 1911 model and later. So most of the ones that you find for sale are actually World War II, some of them are even later. And the principal difference that you'll see is that this has as we'll put it close to the camera there, this has a saber style grip with a wooden grip with ribs and a backstrap, okay? So the construction of the hilt, it's actually very close to the old Prussian 1852 cavalry saber, which is basically what the guard is based on. But this type of hilt with the wooden grip, ribbed wooden grip, it's bare wood incidentally, seems to be painted. I don't think that they were ever coated in leather or anything like that, or covered in leather. I think they were always pretty much bare wood, although they seem to be painted black maybe. This one certainly appears to be. And this ribbed style of grip was on the 1898 pattern and on the 1905 pattern, but then when the 1911 pattern came in, the main change is that they changed the grip construction to a full width tang. So a tang which has a full width, visible full width all the way up. It has no back strap. There is a screw at the end holding the guard on basically, but then you have grip scales, okay? So a bit like how many knives are constructed, and indeed how the in Britain, how the Charles Reeves patent solid tang was constructed. And those grip scales can be made of various materials. Usually the European ones are made of wood, and the American ones are, and certainly later period ones, seem to be made of some kind of composition material, so kind of like pre-plastic or early plastic type stuff. Although I must say I don't know exactly the composition of that material, but it's not organic. So this 1898 and 1905 had these ribbed wooden grips, and they are the original kind of style, and they are basically a saber. They're a cavalry saber hilt mounted onto a blade. Now let's talk about the blade for a second. So the blade is quite a characteristic style, and one of the things that you will recognize immediately about these Klewangs is their clipped point. So they have a clipped point, a bit like the stereotypical idea of a pirate sword perhaps, or even a Middle Eastern sword. You know, in fact, these types of tips are most commonly found, certainly in the late 19th century, on Bowie knives. But obviously you do find them earlier on things like the Langmesser and falchions and swords like this. So this type of clipped back, or cat's claw as the Italians called it, point, it has been around actually for centuries and centuries. It wasn't in any sense a new invention, and it is simply a way of enabling you to have a point that is in line with the center of the blade, which gives you better thrusting potential. It also gives you a little false edge. This is a very, very short one, so whether you could use this false edge for any sort of cutting actions is debatable. But on some types of sword which have much longer false edges, definitely you could use the back edge for cutting upwards, or do manchette as they're called, so little cuts at the person's hands and forearms and things like this, perhaps even to the back of their leg as well with the coup de Jarnac, aiming to hamstring them. But principally, I think for most weapons, the reason for doing this is it enables you to keep a broad cutting portion of the blade, so it still chops right the way up to here, but you've also therefore got a pointy blade which you can still stab someone with really easily. Generally speaking, as any regular viewers of this channel will know, if the blade is broader near the tip, it will cut better, it'll have more cutting power. So this is a way of keeping the blade relatively broad near the tip but still having a pointy tip. Obviously if it was just broad and you didn't have that, it would be quite crap at thrusting and you'd have trouble going through heavy clothing and things like this, and definitely through armour, although that's obviously not an issue in this period. So the clipped point is definitely, I think, the most recognisable feature of the Klewang blade, or Maréchaussée sabel, as it was actually called in the time of this one. And the second thing probably is this fuller, which is ground in, and it looks quite machined. And it has to be said, and they literally ground in, milled in. And it has to be said that this is a little bit different to what we see on most saber blades, because most saber blades, the fuller, usually there's a more defined shoulder here. Usually the fuller has a more defined start, and usually the fuller goes further up, or it transitions into a diamond section blade on most sabers. Going from this kind of isolated fuller that starts here and ends here and then has a flat section, to me gives it the look more of a 20th century military weapon, which, let's face it, is what it is. And it looks more like certain fighting knives we might be, and bayonets we might be familiar with from World War I, World War II. So it has, to me, a more 20th century look than a 19th century look, despite the fact that this blade does actually have its origins at the end of the 19th century. Also, the edge as well. So these are usually sharp. For one reason I'll go into straight away without going on to too much of a tangent, these weren't only weapons, they were also tools. And I've spoken about very much in the past how often short swords, very often the people that were carrying them weren't only using them as weapons, and very often they weren't only intended to be weapons, they were intended to be both weapons and tools. Yes, you would clear brush with this, you might split firewood with this, you might gut an animal with it potentially if you didn't have a smaller knife, although that would be difficult. But indeed you could also fight with it, and this has been sharpened, and this does have some little notches in the blade. Who knows, it might have been used in combat, you never know. It has to be said, these Maréchaussée, the native police in places like Sumatra, were probably far more likely to use weapons like this in hand-to-hand combat at the beginning of the 20th century than a lot of the 19th century swords and bayonets that we look at regularly, because they were actually coming into, that's why they had these, they were coming into close combat. And I'll talk a bit more about how these were used in a second, because there are manuals that survive. So yeah, the other thing which is very recognisable about these is they have this scooped in, ground in kind of section near the ricasso here, plunge grind I suppose it is, where the edge scoops in slightly, and it's quite a, I have to use my hands to demonstrate this, it's quite a shallow grind. Okay, so the edge bevel, which is a single, it doesn't have a secondary bevel, the edge bevel goes all the way back to there on the blade. Okay, so it's got quite a fine edge on it for a European military weapon, and you have to bear in mind this is a European military weapon but intended to be used in Southeast Asia, so it takes a lot of inspiration, I think, from edged weapons from that region. So it's very sharp, has a fine edge. I have to say, based on my own experience of seeing lots of Klewangs, that they do often have edge damage, and I think the principal reason for that, partly it could be just because they were used a lot more than most edge weapons at that period of history, but I think part of it as well is they were used for a lot of different jobs, and sometimes they hit stones, sometimes they hit nails in wood, and so they're more likely to pick up edge damage. That being said, I have to say this specific example, it has, I mean, if I just go along, it's got small notch, 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 oblique, so coming into an angle, slightly bigger notch, small notch, slightly bigger notch, small notch, slightly kind of medium notch, slightly bigger notch, slightly bigger. So just to give you an idea, that's the first half of the blade up to the point. It's got a fair number of edge notches, and those do appear to be from another bladed weapon. Now, of course, we never know whether that was because it was used in combat, it was, you know, you fought with to the death or whatever. It could just be from two people with two of these messing around. We don't know. But I have to say, given I've seen hundreds of these probably in my collecting career, a lot of them have edge damage. So it seems that they had quite hard lives. And I have to say also, they often have damaged grips and hilts. I think this is also indicative of the fact that they were used quite brutally, either for chopping up wood or cutting brush or just messing around with, or for fighting with. So in terms of the grip construction, why did they switch from this construction with essentially a saber or traditional saber construction with a wooden grip and a backstrap, switch to the full width tang with the grip scales essentially screwed on, bolted on? I think there are two reasons, okay? Which is more dominant, I don't know. One is strength, and I'll come back to that in a second. We know that they were concerned about the durability and strength of these, partly because they're being used as tools as well as weapons. And the other part is perhaps sort of economic or production methods, should we say, factory production. And I do think that generally speaking, it's probably easier to make a wide tang with holes in it and bolt grip scales on, and then just screw the end of the guard onto the end of the tang, rather than making a traditional saber style hilt. Though that's open to debate. It might be not the case, and it might be that it was purely about durability. Now, I said I'd come back to the durability issue. We know that they were concerned about the durability of these, and in fact there was a report written on them. Again, in the link below you'll find more information about that. Initially with the 1898 and the 1905 patterns of these, with this hilt construction, sword construction, essentially saber construction, the first one had a riveted tang end, and what it was found was either, there obviously is mixed reports, either it was because the tangs weren't quite robust enough, or it was because it was a peen tang. They found that the hilts got loose, or maybe the hilts got damaged, or the tangs bent. I don't exactly know, but for some reason they transitioned to having a screw, and you might be able to see, you probably can't in this, oh yeah, you probably can, there we go. You can see it's actually got a screw end in there. So that if it does get loose, you can tighten it up again, or take it off and repair it, replace parts, whatever. So that is one of the main ways you can tell the difference between the 1898 pattern and the 1905 pattern. The 1905 pattern has a screw on the end, nut, and this has got that, so this is the 1905. It also, I should say, nice examples of these often have brass plates like this one does here, and various markings. You'll sometimes find regimental markings on the scabbard, sometimes on the sword. This has got regimental markings there underneath the guard, and it says PD Loonschloss Solingen on one side of the ricasso, and it's got a approval stamp with a crown over a letter B, looks like, on the other side. So they have various military markings on them. Just briefly about the scabbard. So this scabbard is the later type, so presumably this remained in service beyond 1911, and I believe it was in 1911 that they replaced these, or rather modified and replaced these scabbards. This reinforcement brass plate that this one's got on it, just trying to get it to focus on, there we go. So this reinforce here, there's a missing leather strap from there incidentally where it's broken off, but this style of scabbard I believe is from 1911 onwards, so this was probably still in service by the time World War I came around, despite the fact it was probably made between 1905 and 1911. Yeah, what do I think about them as weapons, and how are they used? Well, firstly, just as a cutlass, yeah, lovely. I know lots of people, there's lots of HEMA people have one of these in their collection, because they often come sharp, and you only need to do minor restoration on them to make them really good cutting sharp. They are quite popular for test cutting, and they do cut really, really well. As you'd expect, it's essentially a falchion, isn't it? It's essentially a falchion, hanger, langmesser. It's very close to being, obviously, it has a saber hilt, but functionally you can do it with the thumb up, or you can do it with a hammer grip. They're quite short grips, but you can get the thumb up, nevertheless. I can, and my hands are fairly long. So they feel great. They are quite blade heavy, so the point of balance, as you can see, despite the fact it's a short weapon, it balances far from the hand. So they have a lot of cutting power, but they're light and they're small, so they don't feel heavy and unwieldy, but they still hit with an enormous amount of authority, and I have no doubt that you can take limbs off with that without a huge amount of effort. Good handguard. It is one-sided, which does make it more comfortable to wear, of course, because it can sit flat against your body. It does mean that if you're holding a hammer grip, your thumb is a little bit vulnerable if you're fighting someone else with an edged weapon. In terms of the blade length, obviously they're short, but that's part of the people using them this would have been the maximum blade length that they would have been used to using in their own native weaponry arsenal. So they would have been comfortable with that. Obviously it's short if you're fighting against someone who has a cavalry saber, for example, or a longer sword, but predominantly, of course, you'd be fighting other people who also have short weapons. They might have a kris or whatever. And if you're fighting someone else with an equally short weapon, well then, or even a shorter weapon, well then this is long enough, isn't it? But the other thing they might be fighting people who have is bayonets mounted on the end of a rifle. And in that case, it's all about crossing that bayonet that's coming at you and grabbing it, commanding it, and coming in close, okay? If you're doing that, then actually a shorter weapon that's a bit more nimble and quicker to invert, so to get from up to down, can actually be an advantage. And it can actually be harder with a longer sword to face off against someone with a bayonet or a spear. So I think a great functional weapon, good hand protection, nice grip, very solidly made. You can use it as a tool, of course. Good fighting weapon, good, practical scabbard. So I think they're really good. Now, apart from the obvious way, how are they used to fight with? Well, quite simply, so what the treatises show, what the manuals show, the early 20th century manuals for these show, is that they were either used basically like a saber, okay? So you'd probably ignore anything below the waist because they're fairly short, so you can't really attack down low without exposing your sword arm and your head quite vulnerably. So they were used pretty much like a cutlass or a saber, standard European method, nothing particularly unusual. And yes, these guys probably would have been drilled and trained in standard saber method. I believe that their standard engaging guard is essentially a terce, but I haven't looked at the manual for quite a while. And I would imagine to some degree these native police just did whatever they wanted. But there is an important thing which is really nice, and I have mentioned this actually previously in videos, and that is in the manual. It explicitly shows a firearm being held as against in the left hand, which of course potentially can be used as a parrying device. And we know that, for example, the Gurkhas, obviously very different culture and to a certain degree different period as well, but we know that the Gurkhas did this, and we know other anecdotal examples of people doing this where they've shot their firearm, and the people with these often would have had rifles or carbines, sometimes pistols, but if they've got a long weapon like a carbine or a rifle, they hold it in the left hand and they either keep it out of the way, but even if they're keeping it out of the way, it's still protecting this line to some degree, or they could use it actively for blocking. So an interesting thing. I won't go that much into it because I'm putting my hands up. I haven't properly studied that manual, so I don't want to say things that are completely wrong, having not studied it, but I have flicked through it and it seems to be interesting stuff. So there we go, the Maréchaussée sabel, as it's called, commonly known as the Klewang, a famous sword of the Dutch East India Company, used in Southeast Asia, principally Sumatra actually, and used principally by native police, but later on it was used by a whole host of other people, and these were still in use in World War II and beyond. And in fact, during World War II, many of these got captured by the Japanese when the Japanese overran what had been Dutch colonies. And they actually made use of these as well. You do find, in fact, they're not uncommon at all. You do find versions of these where the guard has been cut off and left only with a little bit of guard up here, a bit like a suba, and they cut off all of the saber part of the guard. And they're still used obviously as tools and weapons like that, but without the saber part of the guard on. That's what the Japanese did to them, and I'm sure some locals did that as well, to use them as machetes and tools. Also, importantly, the Americans later on during World War II, the Americans did use this as the basis for their, I think, the last model that was ever made in America for the US Navy, for a naval cutlass. So clearly the Americans thought they were good, and not that the Americans, I shouldn't think, ever used naval cutlasses in World War II, but nevertheless, even at that point, they were still in the military and naval mindset. that hand weapons were still important. And in some parts of the world, they still were, of course, even after the Second World War. Anyway, I hope that's been somewhat interesting and useful. If you want to learn a lot more about Klewangs or Maréchaussée sables, I'd really like to know how to say that properly. Apologies to all the Dutch listeners. Have a look at that forum thread below here. There's some great information in there, very, very detailed, probably more information than you'd ever need to know on Klewangs, but nevertheless, it's a great resource. So thanks to Ian and the other people who contributed to that thread and put that information out there for us. Thanks for watching, give us a like and subscribe, and I'll see you really soon for another video on Scholar Gladiatore channel. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.